Hello again, this is Maria from Lógica MX, and today we are adding another video to our series, Masters or Mentors in Latin America. Today we have the pleasure of having Otávio Bueno. Hi, Otávio. Otávio is going to talk to us about Décio Krause, one of the most important Brazilian logicians and philosophers of science, in particular physics, and metaphysician, and so many things about Décio. So, Otávio, thank you very much for being part of the project. Can we ask you a bit about you? You were born in Brazil, but now you are in Miami. So how did you become a philosopher, a logician, a philosopher of science, and how did you end up in Miami?
Okay, Maria. Well, first, thanks for the invitation to speak to you. And I think it's a terrific project that you are developing. And of course, I'm thrilled to talk about, someone that has been for me a model of researcher, philosopher in person, which is Décio Krause. So to answer your question, so I it's interesting. I've always been interested in issues about science, right? And when I was doing my undergraduate at the University of São Paulo, the first class I had was a class by a philosopher of science. His name was Professor Raimundo Chiappin, and he was giving the card, but from the point of view of the science. And I was very interested and curious about those things. And at one point he said, "Look, if you're interested in philosophy of science, you need to know some science." And he said, "Okay, so you should go get some courses." He recommended I take some classes in the economics. So I went there. I took a class in microeconomics, and remember, they said, "Well, there is this function, demand and supply, and there's an equilibrium, and it's here." And I was puzzled. I said, "Look, don't we have to prove that there is this thing?" So yeah, but you need to know calculus to prove that. So I said, "Okay, well, guess I have to go to the mathematics department." So, and then I was completely taken by that. It took all my electives in the mathematics department, and in parallel, um, I took logic classes and got interested in those issues. And then, of course, um, I was told, well, if you're interested in those things, you should attend Professor Newton da Costa's seminars. So I went there and talked to Newton and said, "Hey, can I attend your seminar?" I said, "Sure, of course, come along." And he had a seminar every Monday afternoon. Um, and so for years, we will show up there and talk about logic, mathematics, philosophy, foundations of science, physics, whatever came to his mind. And it was a really interesting uh, context. And he had a bunch of visitors that would come year round to talk to him, people who came from all over the world. And and of course, he has also his students, both current graduate PhD students and former students that he also invited to speak at the seminar. Um, and it was in that context that, of course, I heard about Décio Krause. And so, in fact, I heard about him before I knew who, I met him, because at that time we're talking about early 1990s, right? He had already finished his PhD, and he was then a professor in the south of Brazil, in Paraná. And he was in the mathematics department, and Professor Newton always spoke about him very, very fondly. And we could see how proud he was of what Décio did, because Newton had this lovely book, Essays on the Foundations of Logic, which is one of those books that you read, it's beaming with ideas, all kinds of things. And in one point, he says about, look, to understand the foundations of quantum mechanics, we may need to think about the fact that on some interpretations of the theory, it looks like quantum particles don't have well-defined identity conditions. That raises a big problem if you want to use classical logic, which basically assumes with the principle of identity that every object is identical to itself. So how can you possibly make sense of the foundations of quantum physics, especially non-relativistic quantum mechanics under those interpretations, if your underlying logic undermines what you want to say at the level of the physics? And at that context, he said, well, what we need is to develop a set theory that would allow us to express those things without assuming that every object in the domain has identity defined to it, right? And he lived that, right? So when Décio comes along, that was before I was there, right? Décio comes along and is looking for a problem for his PhD dissertation. So Professor Newton just came to him and said, look, why don't you develop the theory, right? And he had some ideas, gave some suggestions, but then it was Décio who then sat down and said, okay, develop a quasi-set theory, a theory in which the principle of extensionality from set theory, that two sets are the same provided that they have the same members, may not hold in general. That was the central idea, and the question was how to develop this in a mathematically coherent way. And that's what Décio did. And he developed that. He not only he did that, he showed, in fact, he was one of these motivations was the work of Hermann Weyl, who had this beautiful book. Newton also always talked about his book on the philosophy of science, and he had a discussion about how can we handle those cases in quantum physics. And Weyl had this idea of, look, we maybe should treat these as aggregates, right? We're lumping them together in kind of some kind of class equivalence class, and without paying much attention about their identity, right? But Weyl was doing this pretty much within the context of classical logic, right? And Décio picked that idea and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Instead of talking about quantum objects that have identity conditions, we're actually going to replace by things that have satisfy an equivalence relation without assuming that they have identity, right? So all we know is that, well, there are things for which, they are reflexive, symmetric, and transitive relations hold over those things, right? So if one, and what is that relation, right? And he said, well, we should think of it as an indistinguishability relation, the relation in which you cannot distinguish any member from that equivalence class for another. It doesn't matter which, right? But if one is, then any other that is indistinguishable from it, right? But we do not assume that they have identity conditions, right? So it's just an equivalence relation. So, and you can see why that's the case, right? So the model is you think about imagine an equivalence class of electrons, right? So if you have two electrons, well, one is indistinguishable from the other. It's going to be indistinguishable from itself. If one is indistinguishable from the other, this other indistinguishable from a third one, then the first is going to be indistinguishable from the third. So it satisfies the reflexive, transitive, and symmetric relations. And that was his inspiration. So in the dissertation, he talks about these Weyl aggregates, right? And then motivated by that, think about, okay, how a quasi set theory that it's not a full set theory in the sense that not every set has an identity condition, but how can we formulate a set theory like that right? That would do the kinds of things that those early quantum physicists like Weyl, Schrödinger, and even Heisenberg realized that was needed, but they never really developed, right? They talk about, Weyl talks about things like, well, if you have an electron here, have an electron here, call this Ike, call this Mike. If you swap them around, that doesn't change the state they are in. So he says there's no alibi for an electron. We don't know who did it because we don't know who is Ike, who is Mike, right? He talks about those things, so they're indistinguishable, right? But he's assuming classical logic. So how can we do that, right? Schrödinger also talks about the difficulties also of making sense of identity in quantum physics, and so did Heisenberg, who insisted that we need the logic cannot be classical. He said the language cannot be classical. We need something different. So Décio was immersed in that problem situation. And what he was motivated by that, he was saying, okay, how can we actually develop a set theory that would allow us to say those things? And if essentially that's what his work in the dissertation, that then he paved the way for a series of papers that he developed over the years, right? But we heard about all of that, right, from sitting at his seminar, right, Newton da Costa seminar. Newton would describe those things, talk about Décio in that context. And then one day, of course, he invited Décio to come and give a talk to us. And we were all very excited, right? He said, well, we're going to finally meet him, right? And it was the most amazing thing, because he was enthusiastic, full of ideas, engaging, very accessible, extremely friendly to all of us, right? And also he came from the same part of Brazil as Newton da Costa did. Both are from the state of Paraná, right? And one of the things, so I and several of my colleagues at the time who were sort of graduate students or who were working with Newton da Costa in their PhD dissertations, none of us were from the south of Brazil, right? And one of the things that caught our attention was Décio spoke exactly like Newton did, with exactly the same Southern accent, and we found that so endearing, right? And it's very interesting because it's an accent in which, when you move north into Brazil, the sound gets all mixed up. But the southern part of Brazil, because probably the proximity of Spanish-speaking countries, they say the T, for example, very strictly. They will say, for example, for milk, they will say leite, and we would say leite. So it's like you say each sound a little more carefully, right? And we thought that that was so incredible, right? So even the way they speak, Newton and Décio were very similar, right? So that was the first time I saw him, and from that day on, I was hooked in a way, right? So by the way he brought us in, that sort of the attention he gave to us, I was barely starting my MA dissertation, right? But he was there asking.
How many years was this ago?
How many years? Well, we're talking about, this was probably 1993, 1994. It was last century. Right? So,
Yes, because something that is surprising about Desio is that he keeps having this like very energetic spirit and very engaging personality, and it looks like it's the same Desio that I met maybe 20 years after you did, and so that is something really amazing about him. And I was wondering, first, something really interesting about Décio and Newton's work is that usually people think of Newton as being only a logician, right? But he was very committed to philosophy of science. And so the fact that Décio took all those interests and just grew on them and make more and more research and good things the connection between physics and logic and set theory, and that's very interesting. But it also reminds me of your line of work, right? You are also a person that has commitments in logic and philosophy of set theory and also in philosophy of science. So I wonder how your work has connected at any point, and whether Decius' work has inspired some of yours and so on. So
Oh, that definitely, right? And so, and in many ways, it all started in those seminars with Newton da Costa, because he would talk to us about all of those things, right? So he brought those ideas, and he was, as you said, he was someone Newton, who was always exploring the connections between, the foundations of science, the foundations of physics, foundations of mathematics, foundations of logic, and logic, science, physics, and philosophy as a whole, right? So though none of those things for him were sort of separate, areas of research, they were all interconnected, and they were all important to explore. So I learned this just by seeing the way Newton developed his ideas and articulate things. And then he gave that to us, right? As who was attending his seminars. I was never formally a student of Newton, but actually I was following, I basically attended all his seminars. We would have lunch every Monday together. He would do that with all the members of the seminar. And Décio came in the same way, although Décio was before me, right, by several years. And but it's the same idea, right, of not seeing those areas as isolated, but by actually exploring connections among them as a central tool for investigation, right? So Décio has, throughout his career, as you know, he's explored all of those, right? He developed various logics, right? He developed a particular version of quasi-set theory. He developed applications of the logic and the theory to foundational issues in quantum mechanics. He expanded this to broader issues in philosophy of science, about the nature of the semantic approach, about the limitations include also of the semantic approach. But also he had this really interesting, he has a paper that I love. It's like, it was written in Portuguese, but it talks about Hume, right? And Hume has these discussions about identity, and 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 he said, look, there's something quite interesting going on here, right? Because Hume says, well, it doesn't say that explicit, but the idea is I look at myself at the mirror, I blink. When I look back, I cannot say that I'm the same, right? What I do is I project myself as being the same. So Dacia says, well, maybe that's what we could do to think about um, what's going on maybe in quantum mechanics, right? The identity is not given in the object, but it's something that we project on the phenomena that we are trying to make sense of. So, and with that kind of example, you can see how, in one case, he's already linking a particular interpretation of an important philosopher, Hume, uh, inspired by it, thinking about a specific issue in the foundations of quantum mechanics, and connecting that to a general issue in philosophy, in philosophy of science, right? Just in that little thing. So that's a typical feature of his work, right? That I admire and I learn from and engage with, right? He also, similar to Professor Newton, who also emphasizes that, he said, well, we need to understand what exactly are the mathematical assumptions from the kinds of claims that we are making. Where are these claims being made? In the sense, which is the mathematical background? Because depending on the mathematical background that it's assumed, some of these claims may be false, some of them might be inconsistent, may be incoherent. So we need to be very careful about those features, right? Similarly, we need to be careful, Décio insists on in several of his papers, what's the underlying space in which certain claims are made, right? If the space is Hausdorff, then you can always separate any 2 points. So that means that you can always distinguish things, right? But if the space is not, you may not be able to do that in general, right? He insists about things like, well, we need to be aware of, in the mathematics we're assuming, does the axiom of choice hold, right? If it doesn't, well, there are limitations, right? We cannot guarantee that every vector space has a basis. And that will change depending on the kind of systems in quantum mechanics that you're interested in modeling. That may actually have implications for that. So what I like and appreciate about Décio's work is the attention that he gives to the importance of those things, right? And those are things that straddle any divides between foundations of science, philosophy of science, logic, metaphysics. They are all interconnected, right? So it's not that you're just looking at one tiny issue here and ignoring all the rest. You're exploring the relevance across these domains of these various issues, right? And over the years, so we, of course, Des and I have written many papers together. I've been bugging him about things on his own work that he also very patiently sort of go on and respond to me and say, okay, look, here's something you may want to think about. Here's some problems you have and so on. And we've been going back and forth, right? So I've been pushing him in large part just to be the kind of Pyrrhonian skeptic that wants to cause trouble, right? I said, all right, so you're claiming that, I say, right? You claim that objects, at least or things in quantum physics, and at least non-relativistic quantum physics, don't have identity. Well, but the quantifiers, certainly the classical quantifiers, require identity. So how can you quantify over those things without assuming that they have identity, right? And then I push him. Can we really understand the quantifiers from quasi-set theory? As if this feature doesn't hold, how can we distinguish the existential and the universal quantifiers? Why is it that they don't collapse? Often they don't collapse in the classical case because you have identity that actually allows us to distinguish the objects. And of course, Décio very patiently said, oh, look, here's how we do it. And we're going to move this way and this other way. And I have to go back to the drawing board, said, okay, how about this? And then we keep sort of exchanging. And it's been a really, really stimulating conversation that has been last years now, right? So that we've been exploring those things together. But of course, we agree more than we disagree, right? And we can bracket whatever disagreement we may have and explore things together. So, for example, we wrote, again, many years ago, a paper critically evaluating certain claims about the semantic view of theories, right? And then it's now Décio's time to push me. Say, well, you like the semantic view, don't you? Say, yeah, I do. So tell me this. Folks in the semantic view come along and say that, what matters is not the language in which the theory is formulated, but the models, right? So yeah, that's what they claim. So, but we cannot have models unless we have a language in which we can express those models. So, models are not free-floating things. And depending on the language you have, you may not actually have the models, right? Or you may have different models. So how can that be, right? And then, of course, he's right? And so we wrote a paper together, sort of emphasizing, of course, there is a need for some language, right? You just don't make that the primary component of what science is, as opposed to what a syntactic view would insist, right? That, okay, we axiomatize the theory in a certain formal language, and the focus is on that. So, but the semantic view cannot be the entire opposite that completely ignores the language, right? And then as you also pointed out, I said, look, von Frassen talks about the modal interpretation of quantum mechanics, and he talks about what you can do inside the model, what you can do outside the model. And he said, well, that reminds me of Scollins paradox, right? That well, inside the model, you may have something that has a certain cardinality, models that are, for example, innumerable. But outside, you have uncountably many things, right? So it's part of the same theory, right? And so we in that paper we explore the analogies, right, between what von Franzen is doing about inside, outside the model, and this a way of talking about um, um, or understanding, right, the Scotland kind of set theoretic relativism, right? Now, the other thing that also we push there is said, well, if you think about, for example, um, quantum electrodynamics, quantum chromodynamics, and those kinds of theories in the standard model, right? Because there's no general accepted unification of all those parts, right, of the theory. So there is a sense in which there is no theory in the usual sense that will accommodate all of those things. So, but if there is no theory, how can we speak of the models of the theory, right? But that's what the semantic view says that theories are, or at least they are presented as being, right? So, so that and this is the kind of consideration and worry that Décio will come along, right, and raise, and that in this point he was the one sort of pushing me. Said, okay, you need to clear this out and so on, and then we end up writing a paper exploring those things, which I think are genuine difficulties, right, for the semantic view, and some adjustments are needed, right, and for the view, but it gives you a sense, right, of the kinds of things. He also developed, he has books where he developed very careful philosophical reflections about the axiomatization of physics, right? So he has a book that he wrote with another brilliant Brazilian philosopher of science, a former PhD student of his, Jonas Arenhart, right? The Logical Foundations of Scientific Theories. So, and in that book, what they do is they think very carefully about uh, what exactly are scientific theories, right? And what axiomatizations, how axiomatization should be thought about and understood, right? They make these interesting distinctions between a concrete axiomatic approach, an abstract axiomatic approach, and a formal abstracted approach, right? The concrete one would be the kinds of things you find in regular mathematics, right? Euclid's elements, for example, offer a concrete axiomatization of geometry, right? So regular, standard, run-of-the-mill axiomatizations, right? The abstract ones move one level up and said, well, maybe what I'm abstracting, what I'm axiomatizing here, not particular objects, but kind of objects, right? So where you're not just thinking about triangles, right, or lines and points, but you're talking about entire class of things, right? So think about axioms for group. We have various kinds of groups that are now being lumped together in this a little more abstract axiomatization, right? Um, of course, they're still part of regular mathematics, but it was something that mathematics became more over the centuries, became more abstract. And the way in which it became more abstract was exactly by generalizing the kinds of objects. And he identified the importance of distinguish these forms of axiomatic approach. And the third one is the ones that logicians defend, right? The formal ones, where you formalize the relevant principles in a given language, first order, higher order, or modal, depending on the language in question. And then the rest of the book is a reflection about the importance of being aware of the mathematical background, right? They discuss issues about, well, the role that principal constructivity has in set theory, the different formulations of set theory, different ways, without your element, without, with action of choice, without, and the implications that this has to the understanding of the various models, right? And of course, there are all kinds of criticisms that have been raised to axiomatic approaches, and they respond to those, right? And offer, I think, a very sensible, careful, and stimulating reflection about axiomatizations of scientific theories, and conclude thinking about, again, the role of models in that context, right? This is just one example. Probably Décio's most important book is his book with Stephen French on identity in physics, where you have a beautiful exploration of the philosophical, formal, and historical um, settings involved in this notion of identity in physics, right? There is all the detailed discussion about the metaphysics of identity, the physics of identity, but also the logic of identity. And then the book gives you an amazing picture, right, of how to think about those things. Now, Décio has something that every significant philosopher has, which are two components. You have a certain vision for a field, and you have associated with that vision a technical development. And the brilliance of the work is how these two things hang together, right? And throughout his work, what you find is exactly a very creative, probing, and thoughtful way of integrating that vision that he has about making sense of science, its foundations and logic, with corresponding technical implementations, where you have his Schrödinger logics, you have the quasi-set theories, and all of those things, right? So it's an all-encompassing, thorough, philosophical, mathematical, and logical approach, and anyone can learn immensely from that. And there's not a single conversation that have had with Décio from which I didn't come from it thinking, all right, I have to think this better and learn something and go back and realize that, well, there is more to find, more to explore. And he has this incredible attitude, right? He is someone who is, bringing people together. Hey, come here. How about this issue? Here's what I'm thinking about. Can you help? What do you have to say about this, right? And
Absolutely. I think that is like the main social characteristic of this in academia. But, let me say something before we pass to the next question, which is that I think you are absolutely right. Something that one have to acknowledge that Décio has done for the discipline is to put much rigor in how we find case studies for certain logics or certain formal tools, as well as how do we develop these tools for explaining or accounting for certain phenomena in science. I think his work is absolutely a strict, very well polished. Décio doesn't publish something like that he hasn't thought about for a while, and that he has really considered the counterexamples and the objections and so on. And that's something that we should learn from him in general in philosophy of science as well as in logic. But I also wanted to emphasize what you are saying, and this connects with the last question, that Décio is a person that really engages with the opponents in a sense, right? Either they are their students or colleagues, or really like people that think the opposite that he does, and he takes them seriously, and then he tries to help the discipline more than his view, the discipline to grow and to be more rigorous, more strict, more in general better, right? So I was going to ask you, this is the last question of the interview, what do you think are these qualities that Décio has that we can learn from him to improve the academic environments, to make a better academia in a sense?
Hmm. Yeah, no, I fully agree with everything you said about him, right? And he embodied for me what uh, a proper philosopher should be, right? And someone who is open-minded, who is the very opposite of the dogmatist, right? Someone who is challenging you to think differently, to question the assumptions you may have, who explore alternatives to the standard view and the standard uh, picture that it's the kind of received approach about a certain subject, but also being inclusive, right? He says, look, come, let's explore this together. We can do this better if we don't do it just by ourselves, right? And that attitude, I think it's endearing. And it's something that he has. And as I said, from the very first day I saw him in that seminar in Newton da Costa's class, over, boy, we're talking about over 30 years ago. And he already had those things, was that they were already there, right? And the kind of nurturing that he has of the younger generation, of his students, right? Students of his students, and how um, he helps them move forward, whatever they are, right? And I think those are, and he trained, an entire generation of new logicians and philosophers of science who are now also training others, right? I think I mentioned Jonas Arenhart, right? He was a PhD student from Décio. Jonas has students now. His students now are postdocs who have their own students, right? So you have this kind of generations, and I think that's one way in which the field gets better as a result, right? By nurturing these this new generation, and he does that incredibly well.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Also, there is something very peculiar about this as a student that have, in a sense, copied this very friendly spirit, very inclusive
Mhm.
spirit. That Jonas is one of the examples. I think I I learned a lot of quantum mechanics autonom by Elias Ocon, but I never used it until I met Décio. And Décio and Jonas were always asking me questions, trying to push me into certain debates. And
Mhm.
and they didn't know me at the moment, and they were so friendly towards others, trying to make bigger the community, trying to hear other voices, and all these things are something amazing that one can recognize in Decio's research group, right? So this is the end of the interview. So I would ask you to end up with a thought, a reflection on Decio's impact in not only your work but in the field in which you are right now.
Yeah, well, I think yeah, obviously had a huge impact in my own work, right? He pushed me to be, clear, bolder, more challenging. He helped me think things through. He make me rethink assumptions that I had. Um, and I don't think he did that only to me, right? He did that to generations of researchers, not only in Brazil but elsewhere, right? And even those who may disagree with him uh, realize, well, we need to say something here, right? And we need to engage um, and find a better formulation of what the views we have, right? Because you will find, here's something that you may want to improve, and it's something that you need to do better. And I think that's something he has done and continues to do um, for a very long time. So, and I'm extremely grateful for of course, everything he has done, but also just for who he is. And he's a good friend, and every time we get together, he's such a delight. So,
Well, that's great, Otavio. Is it okay if you send us some references that we can link in the video so people can get more familiarized with his work? And with
yeah,
that, we have to thank you in Lógica MX for helping us to make this video. And we hope that Decio's work gets more spread during the following years.
Yeah, no, that'll be great.
Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.